So what is poverty? Defined by the Oxford Dictionary, poverty is a noun meaning the state of being extremely poor. Well, duh, you could have told me that already. In reality, poverty is a lot more complex than this simple definition.
One should define poverty not only as the experience of having inadequate economic resources, but also as the state of having central capabilities below a given threshold, causing difficulties in achieving the functionings necessary to flourish in society. While society currently views poverty as the condition of living with an income below a national poverty line, poverty varies between individuals and communities, and thus warrants a more comprehensive measurement, a combination of the SPM and other qualitative and quantitative measurements. That sounds complicated, and in all honesty, it is. Poverty is a much more complex state than simply having an income below a national line. However, we promise that we will help break it down so that you'll have a much more comprehensive, empathetic understanding of defining and measuring poverty.
Among the countless methods individuals have discovered to describe and define poverty, we feel the capabilities approach, a concept first expressed by economist and philosopher Amartya Sen, most comprehensively encapsulates what we should discuss when defining poverty. In his book, The Quality of Life, which he wrote alongside Martha Nussbaum, philosopher and professor at the University of Chicago, Sen defines capabilities as, quote, a person's ability to achieve various valuable functionings as a part of living, unquote. Basically, one's capabilities are the actual options and opportunities a person possesses. Let's break it down a little more.
In her book, Creating Capabilities, Nussbaum asserts that in order for an individual to pursue a dignified and minimally flourishing life, a political order must secure to all citizens at least a threshold level of 10 central capabilities.
Nussbaum's 10 central capabilities are life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination, and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment.
For example, if an individual is unable to receive a sufficient level of education, which is included in the senses, imagination, and thought capability, that individual is not living a life of human dignity and freedom, and thus is facing poverty because lacking this capability will result in a lack of achievement.
One might ask whether those who possess sufficient economic resources but seemingly lack certain capabilities can be considered poor. The reality is, however, that if an individual possesses sufficient economic resources, he or she most likely has at least a threshold level of the central capabilities.
Similarly, in his work, Poverty and Affluence, Sen illustrates two different people both starving, but one because he or she is fasting for religious purposes, and the other because he or she does not have the economic means and thus the true capability to eat. As a society, we should primarily focus on those whose economic deficiencies coincide with diminished capabilities.
Of course, while a general capabilities threshold trend exists among individuals, households, communities, and cultures, variances do exist among these entities. Thus, these entities should have the right to access the central capabilities to the extent that pleases their given thresholds and allows them to attain the highest level of functionings that they can achieve.
For example, Nussbaum proclaims that being able to live to the end of a human life of normal length and not dying prematurely are essential capabilities that a life of human dignity require. Due to uncontrollable illnesses that arise in tragic cases, however, not all people possess this opportunity, no matter what a decent political order attempts to do.
Similarly, differences in culture perpetuate slight differences in central capability threshold levels. For example, higher education might not be as valued in other cultures as it is in the United States. Therefore, the threshold level of Nussbaum's senses, imagination, and thought capability would be different in that culture.
As Sen says, poverty is a deprivation of capabilities. However, it is important to acknowledge capability thresholds vary slightly. by ensuring that individuals, households, communities, and cultures have the ability to attain a level of each of the essential capabilities that works for their life circumstances. The government will do its job of providing dignity and freedom to all.
By functionings, we are referring to what Sin calls the doings and beings of an individual or what that individual has achieved given his or her capability set. An example of functionings would be attaining good health, being properly clothed, housed, and fed.
Central capabilities, economic resources, and the functionings they create have a cyclical relationship. An individual, household, or community cannot attain the necessary economic resources without meeting their central capabilities thresholds, and without attaining those resources, they cannot attain the functionings necessary to live with dignity and without social exclusion.
Social exclusion, according to the United Kingdom's government, is a shorthand term for what can happen when people or areas suffer from a combination of linked problems. For example, without the capability to move freely from place to place, one cannot attain and hold down the job that would provide the income necessary to produce capabilities that lead to functionings. Thus, we define poverty as a state of possessing diminished economic resources concurrently with diminished capabilities, leading to a life of social exclusion.
Defining poverty is a feat in itself, but we also need to figure out a proper way to measure poverty. The importance of measuring poverty lies in the basis that we measure poverty in order to find a way to help those who face it. Defining poverty is a feat in itself, but
Currently, poverty is measured using the official poverty measure, an impersonal measurement that provides a poverty line. In his work, Poverty in America, John Iceland describes the, quote, current state of poverty measure as agreement that the existing measure has lost some meaning over time, but little consensus on what type of measure would be better.
We feel that a better way to measure poverty is to use a measure called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or the SPM, as well as discursive measurements. But first, let's talk about why the OPM isn't working so well for Americans. We feel that a better way
as times have changed, the OPM has remained stagnant. As an absolute measure, which Iceland describes as one that, quote, typically attempts to define a truly basic, absolute needs standard and therefore remains constant over time, end quote, has not changed to account for changes in American lives. As times have changed, the OPM has remained stagnant. As an absolute measure, which Iceland describes as one that, quote, problems with the OPM include that it only takes into account related individuals in the household. This means that a foster child would not be included. Number 2, the threshold is only 3 times the household's food budget. This has changed a lot since now food is comparatively a lot cheaper than it was back then. Number 3, it does not take into account geographic differences. So living in New York costs a lot more than living in rural North Dakota. Number 4, it does not take into account in-kind benefits. This includes WIC, SNAP, and other like programs. Problems with the OPM include
The SPM, unlike the OPM, takes into account in-kind benefits such as SNAP, WIC, Medicaid, as well as utility assistance programs, work-related expenses, and out-of-pocket medical expenses. The SPM also takes into account geographic location, because $1,000 in New York does not get you nearly as far as $1,000 in rural Alabama. One of the biggest upsides to using the SPM over the OPM is that instead of using food times 3 to determine a poverty line, it uses the 33rd percentile of overall spending on food, shelter, clothing, and utilities, and then multiplies it by 1.2. This is a better approach to measure poverty because it takes into account what somebody needs to meet their basic needs, plus extra for, quote, pleasure spending.
According to Nussbaum, a community in which wealth and income are both reasonably high and fairly equally distributed does not necessarily equate to a society that possesses religious freedoms, bodily health resources, and is free of marginalized groups. Nussbaum provides a historical example, citing that, quote, societies often contain groups that are reasonably wealthy but socially excluded. Jews in 18th and 19th century Europe, gays and lesbians in the 20th century United States, end quote, are just examples of these.
While these marginalized individuals may have possessed an adequate level of income and wealth, The marginalization they faced served as a corrosive disadvantage, hindering their freedoms, well-being, and chances of achievement. Nussbaum challenges that the real question one must ask is, quote, what are people actually able to do and be? What real opportunities has society given them? Unquote.
For example, one could ask, do the individuals in Community A have the opportunity to enjoy recreational activities? To answer this question, one should analyze qualitative data of parks, athletic arenas, shopping centers, movie theaters, etc. In addition, one should consider quantitative factors such as the number of options a community has, and if that community's crime rates allow for safe enjoyment. Discursive analyses can also provide use when compared between communities and demographics. If a certain demographic A has a lower rate of high school graduation than demographic B, one would question the quality of demographic B's schools, not only taking into account grades and test scores, but also considering the quality of its resources. Often, as in this example, discursive measurements stem from numerical measurements. Thus, it is the combination of these two forms of analysis that provide the full picture of capabilities a community is able to provide for its citizens.
You've probably faced a lot of new knowledge throughout this presentation, so let's try to wrap everything together. An individual is facing poverty when he or she lacks the necessary economic resources and fails to meet his or her central capability thresholds, which vary from person to person, community to community, and culture to culture. These deficiencies lead to a life of social exclusion, that is, the individual is unable to participate in dignified daily societal life. In turn, one should measure poverty using a combination of the SPM and discursive measurements, allowing us to analyze the true well-being of individuals and communities. You've probably faced a lot of new knowledge throughout this presentation, so let's try to wrap everything together. An individual is facing poverty when he or she lacks the necessary economic resources and fails to meet his or her central capability threshold.